really happy to introduce the chair for today, who's Julie McCarthy, and I'm going to try and get this right on the first take, Julie, for your job title. Julie is the lead for Culture, Health and Wellbeing and Young People's Social Prescribing at Greater Manchester Combined Authority and the Health and Social Care Partnership in Greater Manchester. Nailed it?
Absolutely, better than I could do.
Fantastic. Julie, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks everyone for coming. So we've got a really interesting session today with some great representation from organisations in Greater Manchester to talk about loneliness. So in preparation for this session, I was trying to track down the reference to quite a shocking stat I heard the other day, which is that loneliness can be as damaging as smoking 15 cigarettes a day and can take up to 15 years off of your life expectancy. To be honest, I couldn't find an academic reference to that. I saw it in a local newspaper, but I think it came from the States. But whether that is actually scientifically proven or not, we do know that loneliness and isolation has a huge impact on the lives of everybody throughout the life course. I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to show you some nice pictures. But I'm just going to give you a bit of a kind of an introduction to loneliness, and I'm hopefully praying that I'm not repeating anything that anyone else is going to say, because I have worked with all of the lovely people who are presenting today. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and I've shared myself. So what I wanted to do was to share a really beautiful short animation with you made by someone called Shane Mullins, who was part of Loneliness Connects Us, which is a project I think you're going to hear a little bit about later on. Yeah, it's just about a minute and a half, and I think it really sums up the issues really well.
Loneliness is returning to an empty house with nobody to greet you. It's trying to find the motivation to call on somebody that wouldn't even meet you. It's the little moments that make you remember your loved one's past, the routines, the dreams, and the questions that you didn't get to ask. It's having dinner alone. It's being cold in the winter. It's that moment when you realise you truly missed it. It's trying to make a new friend after all the other ones left. When you live on your own, feel alone, and don't get dressed. But loneliness is more than being alone. It's a state of mind. You can be surrounded by people, and loneliness you will find. It is waiting until daylight to sleep, so you can hear traffic. It's wanting to feel wanted, to be relevant, to be a part of your demographic. It's considering to end it all, thinking nobody's there to find you. Or thinking that you must go through something alone, but that isn't the case too. To think yourself as lonely is not something you should hide. Embrace the feeling, start the healing, and soon you can free your mind. Try a hobby, leave your comfort zone, or even volunteer. Or maybe even talk to somebody that will always lend an ear. To be alone can kill the soul, but please do remember, never believe that you're alone in life's great adventure.
Thank you. I just want to share that because it's the voice of I think a young person, really, and I think it sums it up beautifully. And thank you, Pam. That statistic, the reference for that statistic I quoted about 15 cigarettes and 15 years, the reference for that is in the chat. So can I have the next slide, please? I'll start talking before you try and sort the slide out, Dawn. Thank you. So loneliness is when we talk about loneliness, we're not just talking about being alone or feelings of isolation. It's also the lack of opportunity to build social capital. And we think about it as something that affects older people, but it actually affects more young people and more young people all the time. And in fact, that there is a greater proportion at the moment in this country of younger people experiencing and feeling loneliness than there are older people. Pam, who we'll be talking later, was led on the BBC Loneliness Experiment in 2018, and they found that 40% of respondents aged 16 to 24 reported feeling lonely often or very often. And this was before the pandemic. So we know it's not just a pandemic problem. It's one of our biggest public health issues, so much so that the government has a Minister for Loneliness and has launched a Tackling Loneliness Action Plan, and they're about to launch a Tackling Loneliness Hub, a digital hub online, which I think is coming very soon. Can I have the next slide? Yeah, but meanwhile, in the pandemic, young people are stigmatized for seeking social contact. So we've all seen, particularly in the last lockdown, a lot of news images about young people meeting. There were quite a lot of images of people in parks in Manchester, kind of university-age students drinking and meeting together, that kind of social contact seeking behaviours, which we know young people need to do. They're programmed to do it, and they need to do it to combat feelings of isolation. But at the same time, as we are lamenting the terrible rise in mental health problems for young people during and as a result of the pandemic, we're also stigmatizing them for trying to do something about that. I think it's quite striking the effect that the pandemic has had, and we all know, I'm sure we've all talked about this many times in our work and our personal context. So in 2018, the Office for National Statistics data talked about 10% of young people feeling lonely often, but in 2020, 69% of young people aged 13 to 19 said they felt lonely often or sometimes, and 59%, this for me was quite striking, 59% felt that they had no one to talk to often or sometimes. So this is a huge problem, and it's something that we really need to put all our resources into in schools, in colleges, primary healthcare, with the voluntary sector to do something about. Go to the next slide, please. So digital is often seen as the problem and the answer. So we talk about digital as being as a way for young people to connect, which obviously it is, and it's a really important vehicle. However, there are 6,000 young people aged 16 to 18 who are digitally excluded in Greater Manchester. That means they don't have access to equipment, or they don't have access to the internet. And we've got 1,300 under 25s in Greater Manchester, so young people who have not accessed the internet over the last 3 months. So although digital could be seen as something that is one of our solutions, there are a huge amount of young people who are usually from deprived backgrounds who may also have other factors, such as being young carers or living with mental health conditions, for example, people suffering multiple indices of deprivation as well, who do not have access to this resource. Also, when we look at people who do get online, there are a lot of problems with that as a tool for addressing loneliness and isolation. Some research has found that young people who identify as lonely are more likely to have Facebook-only friends. So they'll go online, but they'll have a group of friends there who are people who they only ever see on Facebook, for example, and don't really have any profound and deep contact with. There's a lack of social cues and body language online, which can be really problematic, particularly for young people who are, for example, neurodiverse. It can also lead to a lot of misunderstanding and conflict. And also social media, so the Mental Health Foundation has done quite a lot of research on social media, which can really compound feelings of alienation. So digital can be a bit of the answer, but it's also part of the problem. Can I have the next one, please? I mentioned neurodiverse young people. Disability and difference and loneliness is a heady cocktail, and most disabled young people talk about feeling lonely and isolated at some point. Recently, Greater Manchester Combined Authority talked to 450 autistic young people about their experiences of loneliness, and they said almost 100% that they often felt lonely. and a major cause of this was being surrounded, not being surrounded by people, but being surrounded by the wrong people they didn't feel they could relate to or talk to. And so what's the answer to that? Well, obviously, I thought it was important to highlight here that those young people said that they thought that access was really important. So being able to get to places, obviously in a pandemic, that's almost impossible, but training. So training for staff, for workers they were working with staff in venues, and also transport. So being able to get places. So this is when we talk about loneliness in young people, there are some young people who experience a lot more loneliness on a day-to-day basis than others. Can I have the next slide, please? I wanted to highlight this really amazing resource, actually, Tackling Youth Loneliness website. It's a partnership between a lot of different organisations, including the Co-op Foundation. There's a lot of stuff on there that you can use to talk with young people, and there's also links to academic papers, links to projects, some of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. So I just wanted to just put that up there as an example of where you can look for stuff to inspire you to start thinking about how to tackle this problem. Yeah, the next one, please. So I'm going to just finish off by talking about something that we're doing in Greater Manchester. I think we recognise that social prescribing is one of the main ways we can address youth loneliness, because it's something that we can use, a very broad definition of social prescribing. It's something that we can work with the voluntary sector, with schools, with colleges, with health sector, and with sport, to engage with young people about this. So what we've done in Greater Manchester is we've got a survey called the Be Well Survey. Now this is it's a collaboration between the University of Manchester, the Anna Freud Centre and Greater Manchester Combined Authority to measure the well-being of young people in years 8 and year 10. And then to use that to plan interventions. So the questionnaire, I think it's got about 70 items in it. It's been co-designed with young people, and it's going to be rolled out from this autumn. And the first set of data is going to be available in January. And the aim is for that survey to cover all young people in year 8 and year 10. And that includes special schools, it includes PRUs, it includes independent schools as well. We have a coalition of organisations who've been working on the survey and working on engaging with our schools and with young people in years 8 to 10. And the idea is that they will have the data freely available to them to be able to plan interventions to better support young people. The aim of the project is that it's a whole system response, and it pivots the conversation to young people's well-being, and loneliness is a really key part of that conversation. And we're using it to inspire some work that we're doing around social prescribing. So can I have the next slide, please? So I'm working with Dawn, who introduced this session, and with StreetGames and the Association of Colleges. We're working on a college pilot. So we're training pastoral staff at schools to identify young people who need additional support. We are identifying the health structures, so the primary care networks, for example, around those colleges, creating ways for young people to access support and interventions in different ways, because we know that young people don't access healthcare in the same way that more mature people might do. So you're not going to sit on the telephone for half an hour waiting to get through to the receptionist to book an appointment. That's the example that Dawn always gives. So we're creating pathways for support and advice, and these are going to be co-created with health, education and the voluntary sector. And we also have a budget for co-commissioning destination activities. So in social prescribing, a destination would be the thing that you're prescribed, because social prescribing per se is actually the act of having that conversation with somebody, in this case, a young person, identifying what it is that they want to change, what they need, and then identifying where this need can be met. So it could be a choir, it could be a gardening group, it could be a yoga session, it could be a spoken word rap project, it could be a running group, it could be band practice. So the link worker links that young person in with that activity, but we're taking a more holistic view, where we think it is very important to follow that young person's journey from start to finish. So we include the activity they take part in that, and we include the organisation that provides that activity, because it is so important when working with young people that we look at not only the quality of the activity they're going to be taking part in, but the safeguarding around that. And so the quality of the activity and anything to produce, but also the quality of experience, including that they are really safe and held. And the second pilot that we're doing is in high schools. So that is a direct partnership with Be Well. And we are, our plan, so we're actually just in the final stages of securing funding for this. Our plan is to work with 4 neighbourhoods. So the health service is kind of broken up in Greater Manchester into primary care networks and neighbourhoods. So there's between 30 and 50,000 people in a neighbourhood. So we're going to take 4 or 5 neighbourhoods, and we're going to work with all of the schools in each of those neighbourhoods. We're going to identify a cohort of young people in a school, and they're going to train as youth health champions. They get that training involves some work around mental health awareness. It involves some work around almost kind of becoming a peer link worker, but supported and held by pastoral staff in the school. But alongside that, we're going to have a similar pot to the other pilot, where we'll be co-commissioning new activity that young people think is needed. So looking at what the need is, and then working out whether we've actually got the offer to meet that need, and then working with young people to commission new activity. In both of these cases, because of where the funding's come from, we're looking at creative practice, but it could be that we expand depending on funding to other areas such as sport. Those young people who are health champions will be organising campaigns as well as supporting their peers. And one of the things that we're adding to the project, because this has been tried in a couple of other places, mostly in London, is that we're really going to be tracking and mapping career pathways for young people, because we want to really target those young people as youth health champions who are maybe those invisible young people in the middle. So they're not excelling at school, they're not the people you would normally ask to volunteer for a project like this perhaps, and they're not young people who are already receiving pastoral support. They're young people that are kind of in the middle, a bit invisible, not really expected to do too well at school. And what we're hoping to create is an appetite perhaps for a career in health and social care, and by them receiving this training, which is the equivalent of GCSE, they'll be able to go on and take up opportunities which are emerging all the time in Greater Manchester. So that's kind of, I wanted to bring in something practical, as something that in Greater Manchester Combined Authority and the Health and Social Care Partnership that we're trying to do to address youth loneliness within the confines and the constructs of the funding and the priorities that that national government has at the moment, social prescribing being one of them. That's kind of what I wanted to put out there to you today, just as a kind of a scene set, and to tell you what we're doing in Greater Manchester. And the last slide has got my contact details on and my long job title. And if any of you want to get in contact with me about any of this, I'd be more than welcome to have a chat. You could also join the Youth Social Prescribing Network, and I think Dawn is going to put the contact details for that in the chat at some point. If you've got any questions, I think we're going to have all the questions together at the end, but if you've got anything you want to ask, if you pop it in the chat or wait to the end of the presentations and just put your digital hand up. So thanks very much. That's the end of my slides. So we can move on now to a presentation from Professor Pam Qualter. So Pam is a Professor of Psychology for Education at the University of Manchester, and her research focuses on both on loneliness and on emotional intelligence. And I mentioned before when I was talking, Pam led the BBC Loneliness Experiment, which was the world's largest survey of loneliness, and is a really amazing read, actually. So I'm really pleased to welcome Pam. Thank you.
Wonderful. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. I always find it really strange when you start chatting because you can't see everybody, and it just feels quite weird. So I'm glad you can hear me. First, I want to say thanks for inviting me. It's really nice to get the opportunity to speak outside of a very academic environment and talk about loneliness to people who actually can make a difference in supporting these young people. So thanks very much for the invitation. So I'm going to start with something probably we all know, having been through the last 18 months or so, where we have become an awful lot more isolated because of the social restrictions that have been placed on us. And I think we all now realise how important those social relationships are to both our physical health and our emotional health. I think we're probably in agreement that we all need different amounts of social support. We've seen, or social contact. You know, we've seen people say, actually, I'm not so bothered that I'm only seeing, you know, friends online and I'm only doing that once a month. Other people actually are really craving that interaction and needed out of lockdown really quickly to be able to get their hit of social contact. We also know that we all benefit from social contact significantly. It's really important that we've got people that we trust, people that we feel secure with, people we feel that really qualitative connection to. Now, when we don't feel like we have that connection, that's when we feel loneliness. And I loved the video that we saw at the beginning of Julie's talk, because I think that kind of placed loneliness within individual context. This is a very, very academic definition by contrast. It's talking about how loneliness is unpleasant. So it comes with very negative emotions. It's not the same as social isolation or rejection. And it results from us perceiving that we've got fewer social relationships than we want, or deficiencies in the social relationships that we have. So we're wanting more social relationships or better quality relationships. And you can see how, given this definition, it means actually we can be lonely in a crowd. Really don't fit in with the people around us. So loneliness then is an aversive state. And when I started out on this journey of trying to understand loneliness, which was a good 25 years ago, if not more, they didn't talk about loneliness as something that could be experienced by children and adolescents. It seemed to be something that was just experienced by adults once they'd reached a level of maturity to be able to think about relationships in a very informed way. And I kind of thought at the time when I started my PhD that that just wasn't the case. I knew from my own experiences, I'd been very lonely growing up. And I also knew I wasn't that odd, really, that I couldn't have been the only person feeling these things. So I made a very conscious effort to go and find out whether young people did experience loneliness. And what I found, and people, you know, across the pond over in the US were also doing similar research. And what we both found was that children as young as 5 years of age could offer very valid definitions of loneliness. They talked about it being this disconnection from other people, and they did talk about it in terms of quantity of friendships, the number of people you had to interact with. But even younger children, you know, children of 5 years of age, would talk about it often in very qualitative terms, having that other person, having that person you could tell your secrets to, that you felt really connected to. Also, children offered very clear ways of coping with loneliness. They talked about finding people to engage with, but they also talked about mentally changing the way that they were thinking about relationships. What's all is that loneliness, lots of people say loneliness is a feeling, and I kind of think it's a little bit like worry, that it's kind of, it fits with all these very different emotions. So the thing that defines those emotions, though, is the fact that they're negative and they're uncomfortable. So when we talk to people who report loneliness, they often talk about sadness. Actually, often they also talk about being quite angry. They talk about being frustrated. And of course, you can imagine amongst younger people where they may not have the emotional awareness that we have as adults, so we can give the label loneliness, or we can see that when we're feeling angry, that actually that may come from that place of loneliness. Younger children may not be able to do that. So you may get a lot of acting out behavior with young children that actually is a demonstration of their disconnection from other people. Now, the argument that several of us put forward within the field of loneliness is that loneliness motivates people to reconnect. Loneliness in and of itself, whilst it's really quite a negative experience, is positive in the sense that it motivates us to want to change something about our social relationships. So when I feel sad or I feel angry about this feeling of disconnection, what I do is I will use that to try and work out what I'm wanting from social relationships. What do I need to change so that this negative feeling goes away? Yeah, and most individuals will overcome loneliness through reconnection. The issue, of course, is if you get stuck or you don't have opportunities to reconnect with other people that are like you. So this is some information about how loneliness changes with age. So loneliness are quite normative, so they're quite a normal thing to experience at certain points in our lives. What does the data show us? Well, actually, the data shows us that loneliness is pretty stable, but very low from the age of about 7 to 13 years. Then at 13, we start seeing steep increases. So during adolescence, we see very high levels of loneliness. And in the UK, we've just done some research looking at the Millennium cohort data that we've published. What we find there is it's about 10% of 14-year-olds that actually report feeling lonely often and always. We've also looked at the health behaviour in school children data. What we find there is it's about 18% of 11 to 15-year-olds, but we see it actually increase quite significantly over that time. So your 15-year-olds are the kind of the most lonely of those groups. But what we found in the BBC loneliness experiment, and it fits with what the ONS have been showing us, is that when we're looking at emerging adulthood, our 16-year group, our 16 to 25-year group are also reporting loneliness. So it seems like we've got quite a wide range of young people who are experiencing quite high levels of loneliness. What we see during adulthood is it stays pretty stable. There are peaks at certain points. So, for example, just after childbirth, we find that mums report higher levels of loneliness as they're spending less time interacting with friends and colleagues. But we see in the oldest old age an increase in loneliness. And that's because what we're seeing there is changes to social relationships. Yeah, so in adolescence, we see changes in social relationships as people try and find their way in the world and work out where they want to fit and who they want to be. Yeah, so which groups do you want to belong to? What we see in old age is we see the disappearance of those groups. So we start losing friends, you know, due to ill health and death. We stop losing partners. Yeah, so these two peaks in the life course are during adolescence and during oldest old age. This is a question I get asked all the time, which is about gender differences. Actually, I had a PhD student a few years ago who did a big meta-analysis. So she looked at all the studies on loneliness that had looked at gender differences. And actually what you find is there are hardly any gender differences. Once you take into account all the studies, actually there's nothing really much going on. It looks like men and women are much more similar than they are different. Boys and girls are much more similar than they are different in terms of loneliness. Population studies then, what we're seeing here, as I say, in the UK, we have about 10% of children and adolescents who report very often or always feeling lonely. We get some variation across the world, but certainly it's the adolescent years where we're seeing we're seeing the highest prevalence rates of loneliness. Some of these differences across the world could be to do with, we've argued in quite a large number of studies now, it's to do with aspects of culture in different countries. So, in the Western world, it's very individualistic. It's about you going forward and you having an impact. And actually that is in itself incredibly isolating because you're having to make a way for yourself in the world on your own. And of course, that can be very isolating. Okay, impacts then. I don't know how much time I've got. Julie, probably not much time left, but so I'll go fairly quickly through this. Loneliness does seem to have an impact on education. And of course, that's because the majority of the social contact that young people have is in the school environment. There's this peer ecology, if you like, that happens within schools. And what we find is that loneliness is correlated with negative attitudes towards school. Yeah, if you don't feel that connection to individuals within your school, you probably don't want to be there, because that peer culture is such a big part of that. But of course, it isn't just connection with peers, it's connection with adults within the school environment. And what we find is that young people who report loneliness say that their teachers and their parents really don't understand how influential and important this feeling of disconnection is. And we start seeing, certainly during adolescence, we start seeing the impact on academic attainment. There's also some really nice work by Tim Matthews, who's based at King's College, who shows that this impact on academic attainment follows young people through. So even if they come out of loneliness, we still see that they have worse job prospects because they've actually had this kind of impact on their academic achievement earlier on. There's also an impact on physical health. So we heard earlier from Julie about how certainly amongst adults, it has an impact on life expectancy, just as bad as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And I've done quite a lot of work looking at young people and loneliness and physical health. And we see that there are effects on self-reported health, particularly reports around headache and stomach ache. But the biggest thing we find again and again in research is that loneliness has an impact on sleep. And of course, if sleep's being affected, we have the effects then on school attainment, because if you're tired, you're not able to concentrate. But also there's a relationship between sleep and physical activity as well. So if you're tired, you're not going to want to engage in physical activity, which of course we know has a big impact on well-being. We've also done some work looking at how loneliness relates to obesity. We see a link with obesity during adulthood. What we see here for girls, and it's girls only, actually loneliness is related to increases in weight. And that's because girls are comfort eating. And actually we see this relationship happening at preschool level. Kids who are coming home and saying they don't really fit in or they don't have friends, mums and dads are providing comfort food. Loneliness and mental health, you've probably heard quite a lot about this already, but loneliness is linked to mental health amongst young people. There's what we call prospective studies, quite a large number. They're studies that follow the same children through into adolescence, and we see impacts on depression and social anxiety. What's interesting though, I think, is that there seems to be this bidirectional effect, which means that those that start off as being socially anxious increase on loneliness, but those who start as high on loneliness increase on social anxiety. So they're influencing each other over time. And I suppose for me, that's probably because underneath all of these is this idea that these are not changeable things. Yeah, and they impact significantly on self-esteem. This is a nice quote. I like it, certainly. It highlights how loneliness links to poor mental health. It's a nice qualitative piece of work that Lily Verity has been doing as part of her PhD. Here you can see, I just don't do anything. I lose contact with people. I just sit and I think about my loneliness. It's dark. And a large number of young people in her study talked about this darkness. Yeah, this place really they don't want to be. This place that's full of, yeah, it's a bad place. It's full of darkness. There doesn't seem to be that light at the end of the tunnel. So what does work for youth loneliness? Julie, again, has given us a lovely idea that social prescribing might be quite effective. Actually, there's no work on social prescribing. So yours will be the first, Julie, which will be absolutely wonderful. But this is what young people tell us about coping with loneliness. They say it's really hard to trust adults. Yeah, so adults just don't get it. Now, why we don't get it, I've no idea, given that we were adolescents not that long ago. But it's almost like we are, maybe because we've come through it, we know that things are going to be okay. We're just, rather than understanding young people, we're just conveying this, you know, everything will be right. But of course, those young people don't know that. They also talk about an absence of a true confidant. Yeah, they talk about how that means, you know, that's a source of loneliness if you don't have this person that you're close to, that you can tell your secrets to. But also it's a barrier to effective coping. If you don't trust teachers, you don't trust your peers, you're not able to ask for support when you need it. What we've also found, both in qualitative and quantitative work, is that young people employ short-term, ineffective, and often really risky coping strategies. We did some, and it was part of Lily's PhD. She looked at some Childline data. These are young people who phoned into Childline wanting support with loneliness. They were engaged in all sorts of risky behaviour, lots of self-harm. We've shown that with the Millennium Cohort data too, but engaging in risky sexual activity, drug taking, drinking, and so on. And they're withdrawing from other people as well. So they're withdrawing and they're using these things as a way to try and cope. But of course, they're short term. They might alleviate those negative emotions initially, but as a long-term coping strategy, they're very ineffective. The other work we had, and this is another PhD student, Alice Eccles and I, we did a meta-analysis where we looked at all the studies that had looked at an intervention where they assessed whether loneliness was reduced because of that intervention. And what we found was actually most of the interventions are pretty effective. The ones that were most effective were those that addressed social cognition. So they tapped into that very negative thought process pattern that lonely individuals get into, and those were the most effective. But what I will tell you is lots of the others were effective as well. Yeah, that was the most, but of course that's tapping into the most severe aspects of loneliness. You know, those are the individuals that have probably got stuck. But what was really interesting about this meta-analysis was it was actually only the social cognitive interventions that were purposefully designed for lonely adolescents. Yeah, the others were just doing an intervention that they thought might have an impact on mental health, and loneliness was thrown in there as an outcome. Yeah, but those social cognitive interventions, I know that they were targeted at those people who were kind of stuck in continuous loneliness. So they had very high loneliness at the beginning and it's reducing over time. So really we haven't got interventions that have been evaluated systematically that are for young people reporting high levels of loneliness. We just haven't really got very many of them. And what we don't have is we don't have any that look at social prescribing. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity to be able to engage with young people and support them in either managing their loneliness, because of course that's the other thing. If we're saying some of this is normal, it's about managing that. Also, there's no interventions that address the school climate. And of course, creating more inclusive environments is going to get people reporting less loneliness because they're feeling like they connect to something. Okay, final slide, and then I will stop. This is some material that we produced during lockdown because there was certainly this concern, this worry that loneliness was increasing. Reports actually tell us lots of different things. Yeah, there are mixed reports. Some people are arguing loneliness has increased for young people. Some people are saying actually it's stayed quite stable. My suspicion is we've also got a north-south divide, given that quite a lot more of our schools in the north have been closed, certainly in the recent outbreak. These are designed for people who are working with young people. So it could be as a school teacher, as a parent, and so on. But there's some really nice resources. So we've written with Kathy Creswell's team at University of Oxford. We've written the first of these. It's very evidence-based work. So you can feel quite confident in what is being told there. And we are in the process with the Oxford team of writing this BBC bite-sized video, which is for young people themselves. So I will finish there. I know that Julie suggested questions at the end. So I will take questions then, unless people have got questions of clarity that they want to put in the chat room.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pam. That was really, really good. That was really interesting. I was really struck by the kind of universality of loneliness across sort of young people and across the world. And that idea that young people need a confidant and they don't have one. It's such a simple but complex issue to solve, isn't it? So we're going to move on to hear from 42nd Street now. With their guest star, Dr. James Duggan from MMU. And please, if you have any questions and you don't want to forget them, put them in the chat and I'll make sure they get asked at the end, or we'll just ask you to join it at the end. So we have Dr. James Duggan, who's a research fellow in the School of Childhood, Youth and Education Studies at Manchester Metropolitan University. And he works a lot around co-producing research with young people and communities. And recently this is focused on youth loneliness. And we have Rod Kippen, who is the creative producer at the Horsefall and 42nd Street. 42nd Street is a community-based voluntary sector young people's mental health organisation with a strong creative strand of work. And they've been working quite intensively around the theme of loneliness. Carrie Hughes as well, who is an artist and a member of the Creative Collective at the Horsefall at 42nd Street. So I don't know which order you're going in or how you're doing this at all, but I shall hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm James Duggan. Can you see my slides there? Yeah, okay, great. So I should just say before, we've got a delivery coming and we're all getting used to like basically working out each other's kitchens. So my partner's upstairs, so I have to have the doorbell on, and the doorbell, I find it to be hilarious, but it's like a really ridiculous old-fashioned like tune doorbell. So it's probably going to go off during this presentation and I'm going to blush, but there you go. That's lockdown. We're going to get through it.
Did drama there, James. Well done.
I know, drama. It's like
on the edge of our seats.
But like Julie said, Rod and Carrie are here as well to talk. And I'm going to talk for about 5 minutes, which an academic speak is probably about 8 minutes. And then Rod,
no, it's not.
Carrie is going to come in and give their perspective. But after all of that, I will press on. So we start off really by saying, there's 3 of us here today, but this is part of a research project that has talked to lots of different people, and we want to kind of like acknowledge their role, their voice in it. And one of the words that Janet Batsley, who led the initial research project we're going to talk about, she had this idea of polyphony, and the basic idea of polyphony it's a music term. And if cacophony is all things being played at the same time, polyphony is lots of different things happening, but there is different kind of like the guitar's doing its own thing, and the drums are doing their own thing. I'm not a music person, obviously, but you don't try and squash it all together. And I think one of the challenges of our research is we've spoken to lots of different people with lots of different kind of like lifestyles, and how do we kind of like maintain the integrity of their voice and their experience. And that's kind of like one of the themes of our research, really. We started back in 2016-17, and basically trying to think of a new way of feeling and thinking loneliness. The title of of this day is "Why Are We Not Talking About Loneliness?" And we find that people are talking about loneliness, but we found a little bit of a problem, a little bit of niggles in the way that people do talk about it. And we've got these kind of things, the ways of people talk about it is as an epidemic, it's a plague, it's a crisis. And we find that's kind of like a way of motivating resources, and it can be positive. Why do you need to help this young person? Because they're part of this crisis of loneliness. But if we think of something as a crisis, then it kind of frames it in a particular way. It might be a little bit negative. It might be kind of like, reactive, kind of like we have to do everything. And you see it necessarily as a bad thing. And I won't go into all these ideas basically, but there's a type of thing that we wanted to go against, and it was like this picture here of a lone child, with their internet-enabled device, and they're lonely. And what we wanted to do is kind of like put the young person's experience in that. Who are they talking to on that laptop? What are they kind of and what are they doing basically, and locate it in their broader experience of life. And to do that, it's important to talk to young people, and that was one of the big things that we did, really, working with yourself, Julie, earlier on, and then with Rod later on. We got a group of 14 young people together, planned this kind of like project, developed it, collect a load of data. And then in the end, we spoke to about 200 young people, but we did lots of different things. And that was one of the things I think was interesting about the project is, Pam's talking about psychological research, and mainly, uses kind of like, questionnaires and things like that, which is great. But, we went to kind of like restaurants together. We did improv, dancing, immersive theatre. We did all these kind of like things that help young people think about loneliness and their lives in different ways, because people's lives are different, and these different methods can help people talk about loneliness in different ways. We talked to this group of young people, and we asked them what they thought should be interesting or what should be researched about loneliness, and they came up with these kind of like just counting that seven things there. But they're kind of the typical things where you might think like being a teenager, those awkward years. Pam talked about being 15, but also being in a new place. Classic things like being different, being gay, being queer. One thing that was interesting is that online spaces were seen as kind of like, this sort of like slightly risky place, but also a place of connection. So it's kind of, it's not this determinist thing that Facebook is making you lonely. And they're also really interested in asking for help and offering connection to other people. And then as the project developed, one of the things that really came in is that we thought that loneliness had to be understood in like a political way. It had to be understood in relation to kind of like young people's experiences of austerity policies and politics, precarity, inequality, and, call it competitive individualism. It's basically neoliberalism, if people like that word, but it's kind of like you go to school, you do well, you get on, or you're a bit of a loser. And all of these things are bound up in experiences of loneliness, as we found. And on the flip side of that, we found these experiences of loneliness, as Pam said, it's a negative state, but we also found it deeply kind of caught up in ideas and experiences of trauma, of shame and silence, and people feeling like they didn't deserve to have friends. And they were just kind of like pushing themselves out their own life. One of the things we did was, we talked to young people and then got comics, made up around that. And this was kind of like a series of vignettes, basically. This is a young woman who, felt the pressure of, getting changed and posting herself on Instagram, and was given an offer to go out, but she sat on a couch made up, but didn't go out. Could have gone out, didn't want to go out, and was posting it online. And so there we see how, like, the complexity of young people's responses, that they don't always do the right thing, the right thing in terms of making them feel less lonely. this was about kind of like banter and masculinity. You know, young lads can often feel like they can't be nice to one another. Like, I didn't know you could compliment someone till I was about 28. I always thought you had to be mean and nasty the whole time, and actually you can be, and not enough young men know that, I think. And this was something around poverty, and there's a young lad didn't want to go out because he didn't have the trainers. So he thought, like, you know, to go out, to be friendly, to have friends, you need to have, you know, brand trainers, and his mum couldn't afford them. This was a wonderful quote by an amazing young woman, and she came up with this quote, which we kind of took as, you know, what we were understanding loneliness to be. I'll just read it out. Loneliness means something different to everyone because everyone experiences things differently. But I don't think people should be afraid of loneliness. All your emotions are important. If you're lonely, it means you're missing out on something. You need that social connection. And that's basically, you know, what Pam was saying in her research, really, about the kind of like, it's an aversive thing that pushes you towards connection. Right. So moving swiftly on, we're going to do a follow-on project. It was going to focus on mental health, and then the pandemic happened, and, you know, we were one of the, you know, the people affected by that, amongst lots of other more people that were affected by it. So we had to figure out how to do another research project on loneliness during lockdown. And here Carrie has done a drawing of what happened, and basically on a I can't remember what it is now, but it was like a Tuesday and a Thursday or a Wednesday, the different days.
Thursdays, yeah.
Thursdays, we'd all sit around like this, talking about our feelings, and we invited people in to write poetry with us. We explored our rooms, we lay on the back, looked at the ceiling, did all these different things, and it was a wonderful project. And also, like, a big part of you know, my experience and surviving lockdown. I think, you know, it's one of the things that we've all experienced this, you know, and it was a huge part in me staying sane, I think. And so there's you know, a lot of research, a lot of the kind of young people are super creative, and they've created loads of art, as you'd expect, with 42nd Street, and you can see that on the Futures Arts Festival part of it. And we're going to show you a little bit more. And then I know I don't have long to speak to us. This was one of the things a young woman called Jamie Lee. She turned up one session, and she was just like, I want to break things. I'm angry. And we were like, you know, usually we want young people to kind of paint a picture, but she wanted to like tear a picture up. And so, you know, Rod supported her with another 2 young women to talk about their kind of like feelings of anger and rage. And they did this action art project, which was, you know, incredible. And so that's like the inside space at 42nd Street. You know, any questions about this, obviously, you know, talk to us. The questions, best to speak to Rod, I think, about the art. And then this is what Jamie Lee went on to do. The idea was basically, I've probably not told you what the research project is about, so this is, you know, not the best presentation. I'll hold my hand up. But basically what we want young people to do is come up with something like action art, you know, experience it, and then break that down into a series of activities that other young people could do in their homes. And the idea is, you know, you can't, you know, throw paint at your wall if you live at home with your mum. But what you can do, and then Jamie Lee's figured that out, you can write down your feelings on a piece of paper, drip wax on it, you know, tear it up, put crayons on it. And she thought about, it's really kind of like, you know, carefully thought about all these kind of ideas and things that, you know, young people could do. There we go, I'll race through it. I made it, I think. So, Rod, I'll just mute myself and you won't hear the doorbell.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I think as all these projects, especially working with James, we did a project on loneliness, which made us all feel less lonely. So actually in the process of undertaking this process, I think we felt connected. It was one of our kind of, you know, out the pandemic, it felt like something that worked. We'd not met each other in a room. We never got to that stage. So we had up to 10 young people meeting online for the first 6 to 10 months, maybe. But it kind of worked for us, really. We kind of checked in with each other. We looked at changing the project that we weren't going to meet physically, and we were all isolating. So how do we feel connected to objects, or how do we feel connected to our senses through poetry, or how do we feel connected to emotions and stuff, and how do you do that physically through art and creativity? So it was really interesting. A really bright, creative group we had a lot of discussions around stuff as well, invite lots of artists in who saw things differently and brought those kind of things in, and also brought in a Canadian post-capitalist feminist to talk about how we're going to organise ourselves when capitalism ends, what we're going to do to stop Amazon taking over. So it was a really, really crucial work we did, really. But I'll bring Cariad in now. So how did you find it, Cariad? You were there from the off, and I think you were there pretty much every week.
Yeah, so a little bit of background. I came to 42nd Street as a service user a couple of years ago, and then through a series of saying yes to different projects that Rod comes up with, I've ended up becoming a part of the creative collective. So my kind of interpretation of the project was that I decided to do a drawing every day, kind of exploring how I was maybe feeling on any given day. So that kind of ended up, I don't think starting the lockdown, any of us expected it to be as long as it was, but it ended up with like a really long catalogue of artwork that I could look back on and be like, oh wow, so that's an insight into how I was feeling. And I was trying to tackle the kind of idea of toxic positivity. I wanted to try and be a bit more authentic and admit, yeah, this is rubbish, like I'm feeling rubbish today.
How's it been looking back on those pieces, Carrie? Because the pieces are you, aren't they, generally?
Yeah.
You singular, and then things happening around you. So how was it? Did you pick up any themes or anything from looking back at the work?
Well, when we kind of did a review of it at the end, it was interesting looking back at maybe where my head was at the beginning of the kind of pandemic, and I kind of picked up things I hadn't really noticed at the time. I guess while you're experiencing it, you don't really kind of understand what you're going through. So I think there's definitely more feelings of kind of loneliness and the kind of pressure to stay connected, which maybe was taking its toll on me a little bit more than I realized. So kind of looking back at, so the picture on screen now is one of the first drawings I did. And I think it kind of speaks for itself, really. Just feeling quite confused, not really sure how to be feeling, feeling like you need to be ultra productive, but kind of getting like that kind of block, not really knowing what to do. Yeah. So as a result of this, I've started an Instagram account where I just do drawings where I try and kind of increase awareness for mental health issues that maybe have some stigma around them. And I've also tried to start a platform currently it's called Imperfectly Art, and it's taken us a while to settle on a name, so it might change, but at the moment it's called Imperfectly Art. And basically it's a space to kind of make art without feeling the need for it to be perfect and without feeling the pressure of it having to mean something in particular. It's just drawing without really thinking,
I think that's such a good idea, isn't it? Because how do you make sense of the pandemic? How do you make sense of how you feel? And we know that artwork's in a different way. You got the Edward Hopper saying, if I could say it in words, I wouldn't bother painting. So we have this other communication, which I think we kind of put kids off using, really, because we say that art is about copying that Coke can or whatever, or representing something realistically. So this kind of freedom that you could do a squiggle a day, or just in some way map out how you're feeling each day. I think.
And it was kind of so I'm dyslexic, so I really struggle kind of articulating things verbally. So even if I didn't realize I was articulating things through drawing, it was a very beneficial outlet for me as a young person, like going through loneliness at that time. And it was very rewarding at the end of it to kind of look back and review it.
Perfect. And how did you find it being online, Carrie? Because that's the huge change. We'd done very few things online previously.
It was having that creative collective every week was kind of it was something to work towards each week, because I was like, right, what am I going to come to the session this week with? What am I going to say I've been working on? And it was an opportunity for a mental health check-in that I wouldn't have had otherwise, and which I think is kind of the main takeaway from the research, is that having that time and space for a check-in, I think, is vital, because the amount of times that things are kind of kept inside and you don't want to be a burden, you know, but when you're meeting as a group and everyone's talking about their stuff, it offers you that kind of comfortable space to open up a little bit more.
No, that's come through with a few people that attended that kind of, because I was looking at it and thinking, you know, someone said, oh, I had a really shit day, but I feel better coming to the session. And I thought, is that what we offer? We just make a bad day good. But then talking to them more, they were saying, no, I get a top up of 42nd Street and I remember the sport I had there. And, you know, so
exactly.
it keeps us on the, on a path. Yeah. It's been really interesting working online. I think we've found it's kind of, you know, it's benefited some. We've had people take part that have had mobility issues, so they've been able to take part in kind of main, kind of larger projects. We've also had, it's an odd way of half being in a meeting. So if you're having a meeting in a room, you're either in the room or not, but we've had people kind of come along and be in the background, and this kind of feels like a halfway to step in, because obviously you'll understand a lot of young people come into creative work at the Horsefall. Anxiety is a huge issue for them for various reasons, and so feeling that ownership and permission to be in these spaces is a huge part of our work. So I think we will keep an aspect to that for those young people to, you know, start their journey with us, really. So it's been really interesting. I'm not particularly liked working digitally, but we found things that work, and this project was certainly one of those. So yeah,
definitely.
Perfect. Yeah.
How did we do, Julie? Do we make it?
Yeah, you did put almost bob on, actually. Well done. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think that's we've gone on a really interesting journey, if I may use the phrase, from talking quite academically to actually ending up talking about a young person's experience and examining the kind of methodologies for working around this theme. So I'd like to throw it open. I don't think you need me to reflect on what everyone said. I think it's all pretty darn clear. I'd rather, if anyone has any comments, observations, any questions, I'd like to throw it open to the group. So you can either put your digital hand up, or if you want to, you know, just chip in with a question. If you can find your digital hand, I think that would be a good way to do it. So has anybody got any questions at all? Anybody who has spoken today, or even want to share perhaps any work that they're doing that chimed into this? Okay, I'll give you a couple of minutes to think, and I'll ask a question. Oh no, Chris, you have a question.
More of a sort of a comment observation, really. I put something in the chat earlier around the sort of social prescribing side of things, and just some work we're doing in Wigan around the local pilot, Sport England funding that's available in about 10 areas across the country. We've identified the GP system as an area that we want to do some work in, and one of the conversations we started to have there was around, you know, young people don't go to the GP surgery. You know, they wouldn't get a health check, they wouldn't, you know, be able to be referred into stuff, and we've started to have conversations about, well, where can we do these health checks? Can we, you know, get, I suppose, the likes of, you know, the last group there that was speaking, you know, to be able to have the confidence to do the health checks themselves and have those conversations with young people and do the prescribing directly from those places. So, you know, can we do them in leisure centres, and, you know, in gym sessions or whatever, and referring to other stuff? Because I think for me, if a young person has come to a, you know, an arts venue, a sports venue, music venue, whatever, and they've made half a step there to getting that health check done in those venues, and therefore we're more likely to get them prescribed and into something and away from that sort of loneliness at home environment, aren't we? So it's just some work that's going on in Wigan, early stages of conversations, and so I know I've dropped a few of you an email while we've been talking to sort of have a catch up anyway separately about this, but just thought it was useful to share where we were going in Wigan, really.
Yeah, and I think that the work that you're doing is there's quite a lot of pockets of work that's starting to happen really quickly across the country. So I've been speaking over the last couple of weeks to colleagues in Liverpool, in London. I've got another one from somewhere in the southwest next week as well. So people who are going, right, okay, there's a real movement to start looking at this, particularly around social prescribing. And obviously social prescribing isn't the only answer, and so we can use the term social prescribing to mean an awful lot of things when it's useful to do so, which at the moment I think it is. So and I'm not averse to that at all. So I think yeah, and it's going to be great to, I know we're going to talk in the future, aren't we, together. Hannah said the different methods for starting this work were really interesting. How did you plan for supporting young people who struggled to communicate or who needed ongoing help if emotions became too much for them? Rod, that's probably one for you.
So we have a mental health practitioner attached to all our kind of project work, and we do loads of kind of nurturing. I'd say we kind of will communicate with that person one-on-one. We were running a drop-in, so it allowed people just to feel okay in the space and get to know us, and just develop a youth work background, just kind of building up that relationship. We also, I think there's an interesting thing around mental health is to support mental health, do we need to do a project about mental health, you know, and the position of the young person within that? So sometimes I think arts projects are building up your other part of your area. You may struggle with mental health, but maybe the art is a more positive thing. We know it has a beneficial effect on mental health anyway. And I think with the creative collective of slightly older, been through a kind of journey with 42nd Street and able more to reflect on that journey. But yeah, lots of nurturing, lots of kind of working at the pace that young people are happy with. We really support self-care. So sometimes young people will not be there for 2 weeks, and we keep in touch with them, and they just say, I can't do it this week, I've got too much on, or I'm struggling this week, and we'll allow for that space for us to connect one-on-one. And our projects, there's no kind of push that they have to be there. We understand that our young people have many, many pressures, as do young people in general. So it's really kind of, yeah, nurturing, I would say, is the key word for it.
Thanks. Any more questions from anyone, or any observations?
I mean, I could just say something a little bit more about like the research methods. I don't know if, which side people are, like research practice, but one of the things that we wanted to do throughout the projects is sort of just give lots of opportunities. And so like, it's like anything, isn't it? If you don't develop a good connection with someone on something, then try something else. And I remember with Patience, it's not a real name, but you know, one of the things we noticed, she wasn't really participating in the group, but you know, we went somewhere and she started playing the piano. And so the next session we said, like, bring a piece of music that you think talks about loneliness. And she brought in, I think it's The Mission. It's like this kind of like Latin American film. And she was like, listen to the music. I think like the oboe is lonely or something like that. And she's very, you know, clever, you know what I mean? But we were just like, and it just blew our minds away. And then we were kind of like that. So we got the idea of polyphony from. And so I think that's it. It's just kind of like, it's like anything is, if someone doesn't play football, you know, do something else, you know, and it was keep rotating, keep moving, and don't fix, and don't take it as a failure, you know, be okay with failing, but then move forward.
Yeah, I think that's something comes through that creative collective is support and opportunity, and that opportunity is in some ways social prescribing, really, is sharing opportunities and support to take up those opportunities. So that comes through very strong in the request from our young artists.
Pam, I wanted to ask you something about maybe if you could talk a bit about, you talked about people needing a confidant. Could you talk a bit more about that? Is it, and that it has to be, does it have to be somebody their own age? Is that like a mentoring relationship, or are you talking about friendship?
No, I mean, in their interviews, the young people, I think, just wanted someone who would get them, who would listen. And I think sometimes it's not about having somebody who will give you the answers, because sometimes you don't want the answers. You just want to be able to talk through the problem, and just talk about how you feel about something. So yeah, it's about just providing those individuals, and sometimes it might be a teacher, or it might be, you know, another peer. But it's about having somebody. So really, I think if we think about that in terms of intervention, it could be peer mentoring, but it could also be, you know, having counsellors in school or people that young people can just go to.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure they'd raise that in, you know, if they were coming to a link worker for social prescribing. But of course a link worker would know potentially that's what they're after. So it could be about providing with that kind of resource.
It's a real strength of youth work, isn't it? A trusted adult that is there, not
absolutely
just to listen, you know.
Yeah,
hugely important.
Yeah,
and I think go on.
No, go on.
Because I think a lot of times when you kind of reach out for counselling and support, it can feel quite clinical and quite impersonal. So I think the point you made about just having someone just to listen to, and just someone that seems like personable and seems friendly and approachable, I think can do a world of wonders, you know.
And it's somebody who's not judgmental. Somebody who will just listen, and I think it's so important not to say, oh, this is how you solve it.
Yeah.
You know? And I think as friends often we think, oh, we just want to solve it for you, sort it out so you don't feel so down, but actually it isn't what the person needs. They need to be able to manage that themselves and work it out for themselves.
Chris, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, possibly a question for Carrie. I had no disrespect to the rest of us, but I think we're probably all too old. But I suppose in terms of that person that you go and talk to, I hope I've not upset anybody there. In terms of that person that you go and talk to, is that a skill that we just have inherently to listen, or is that something that can be taught? And if it is something that can be taught, I suppose then the question widens to everybody else is, what training do we give to those potential volunteers, leaders or whatever, so they don't become too clinical in the questions that they ask, and actually it still remains a normal conversation, for want of a better phrase?
Yeah, I guess, so I did mental health first training recently as part of work separate from 42nd Street, because I work in hospitality, and I kind of expected it to be quite like textbook, like here's all the different things to look out for, but it was very much a kind of exercise in teaching empathy, which I think is kind of the core of maybe trying to make support more accessible and easier to kind of access for young people. So I guess I think you can teach it to an extent, but I think a lot of it comes from your kind of ability to listen and empathize. So whether or not that can be taught or not, I think is something to explore.
I suppose we ask the academics that question now then, don't we? Can we teach it?
Yeah.
I think it's interesting because it's usually that adult-child thing, isn't it? That the adult gives advice, tells, you know, as you do as parents, really. And I've been a children's rights advocate before, and that's just to listen. So I think it's almost like an ethos behind it, isn't it? A way of working. Yeah, we think we're doing our job if we're giving guidance, and actually we're doing our job if we listen and allow people to make their own minds up as well.
And I think it is a real skill, and I think some individuals will naturally have that, you know, perhaps through their own experiences, but they may just be more empathic to be able to understand what that person is going through and offer what that person needs. But I'm sure there are ways in which to teach that. I don't know what they are, but I'm sure there will be.
Yeah, if you find out, can you let me know?
Yeah.
Dawn, did you have your hand up, your actual hand up?
I did. I think when you host, you can't raise your hand because obviously you're meant to be in control, but I'm not. This has been fantastic, and I just wanted to chip in. Obviously we've been doing research around social prescribing. There's very, very limited research around social prescribing, particularly for young people, but we have been over the last 3-4 years been doing a 2-year research piece, and just some of the learning from that, it links to what you were saying. We actually found that by the end of the project, the social prescribing link workers who we had in post were kind of at that older age of being a young person themselves. So there was that kind of peer feel of it, you know, that kind of someone who relates to what's going on now for young people, someone who speaks the language, that has the right kind of understanding of language that young people are using, and that has a relevance, and also that when the young people were turning up to have a go at different activities, like there was a brilliant anecdote from the link worker and one of the young people, and they said, we went to try a mindfulness class and it wasn't the right thing for her at that time in the end, but they said they had a really good laugh, and it gave her the confidence to go on and try different activities, you know, turning up by herself or taking a friend along. So I thought that was just a nice reflection of what we were talking about. And just in terms of what you were saying around teaching empathy, there is evidence that you can teach and develop empathy. I think Julie and I mentioned it around kind of neurodiversity as well, that you can use stories and play to increase emotional intelligence and empathy skills. So there is a skill set that builds empathy that you can work with. So yeah, just a couple of reflections from me. I thought just so much about.
I wanted to ask a question about stigma, actually, and where stigma fits in here, because we know that there is a huge stigma around saying that you're lonely. So how, and I think maybe this is something to maybe start with you, Pam, so how do you get young people to say that they're lonely?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting question. I mean, in the BBC loneliness experiment, we actually measured different types of stigma. And what we found was there didn't actually seem to be a huge amount of stigma from society about loneliness, but there was an awful lot of self-stigma. So people didn't want to tell others that they felt like this. And I suppose, is it that we've got to, I mean, how do you destigmatize anything? You know, we're managing to do quite well with other, you know, aspects of mental health, but loneliness still seems to be one that people won't admit to. So we can use some similar strategies that we have done previously, you know, where well, celebrities have talked about having mental health conditions. We've made it so, you know, there are ways to, you know, we've raised awareness in the way that, but it's kind of like, how do we do that specifically about loneliness? I don't know. But I think we can take quite a lot of things from what's happened previously with other.
Okay. Anyone else, Rod or James or Carrie Ann?
So part of the Arts Council funding, we made a short film, we spotted a play, did a public realm piece, and then we also did the young people collated a room where they'd feel okay being on their own. So kind of explored what does solitude give us? You know, it's got real links to kind of creativity and all these kind of stuff. So we did have that, but I think it's almost like a failure, doesn't it? I think it feels a personal failure. You've not, you know, you're lonely because of who you are, type stuff. So I think there's loads more work needs to be done on that.
I think as well, yeah, and it goes back to something we were talking about before about the fact that because we're in an individualized country, you know, it's almost like, well, no, you need to be able to go on your own, and you definitely can't say you don't like it. So, you know, it's that society's attitude that goes beyond just being isolated and goes towards more about
really with a couple of people, and I imagine it's the same for the general public, have really lost the sense of themselves over lockdown. You know, I met with a young woman the other day. She said, I used to be really noisy and loud. I don't know where I've gone. You know, she's struggling to kind of find, she's had a stop, everyone's stopped. And she's just coming in just to check in really now. You know, she's just kind of getting used to being around people, find out, because we know who we are through our interactions, don't we? So I think there's going to be a lot of people struggling with that, particularly kind of young people left school, I think.
I think a lot of it as well, it comes down to not wanting to be a burden. I think the amount of times that you feel like, you know, so I guess especially with young people, it sometimes seems as though it's like, oh, well, back, you know, it was harder for us, you know, when we were your age kind of thing. So it's that kind of pressure of, oh, you shouldn't feel bad. Look how much you've got, you know, kind of thing. So it's that pressure of not being a nuisance. I think is a part of it as well.
Yeah.
I suppose that's why it might be really good to make sure that young people in school and colleges know that there are places to go to be able to talk about that thing away from, you know, so you're not a burden on your peers, you're not a burden on your parents or your teachers, you're going somewhere else for somebody who gets paid to be able to talk to you. Maybe that is more helpful. So those kind of almost universal interventions where it's just saying to young people, if you ever get to a point where you need that support, these are the places that you can get it.
Yeah. And funding those, really, you know, our drop-in was kind of, it wasn't funded, but it was a place where we had most diversity. There was no pressure to produce something. It was just a place to be and be creative. And I think that's really lost with the loss of youth services. You know, they weren't perfect, but they were a place you could just go and be, weren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, go on.
But I was going to say, I think one of the things is like, you know, in what ways do we want people to talk about loneliness, and what's the point? Like a lot of the problems that we have now, any particular problem, we raise awareness and we do these sorts of things. And I think that's kind of, I think one of the things that we were interested in the research is trying to kind of like say, you know, youth loneliness emerged as yet another sort of like youth issue that had to be solved. And it had to be solved in particular ways, and we had to develop, you know, policies and programs and spaces and projects. And what we found is like, you know, after about 10, you know, you know, like you say to an 8-year-old, are you lonely? And they might be able to go like, yeah, I'm lonely. And you know, they're kind of just like simpler in a way, a lot of them. But I think once you get past kind of like, you know, you're a bit older and you're a bit more anxious, and you're trying to find your way in the world. And I think like, you know, I experienced loneliness quite profoundly when I was about 20. And I think I didn't know what that was. And I think that could be like a message to tell people. And I think it works, you know, at 42nd Street, they've got more young people turning up and saying they're lonely, not they're depressed. And that creates different pathways out of that. But, you know, I think I'm kind of a little bit against, well, I'm just against it, just saying like we're going to have like loneliness services or silos for lonely people or these places that you go. I think, you know, the way we would fund it is like, you know, cultural democracy and, you know, kind of like everyone having access to the things that they want. And I think that's obviously not going to happen, or it could happen, but it's not going to happen. But, you know, I think the thing that, you know, to talk about is this is political. You know, it's a situation that young people are facing right now. You know, the way that technology is developed, all these things are, you know, it's an incredibly difficult time to be alive when you're young. It can be brilliant, it can be incredibly difficult. And I think that's the kind of way that we could talk about it in terms of developing kind of like, you know, ways of thinking about politics, ways of thinking about society as much as yourself. And I think if we go around thinking about, you know, where are the only young people, how do they feel and how do we help them? I just think, you know, the agenda will have moved on before anyone figures that out, anything that works. But, you know, and it's the same for kind of like most things, I would say, that don't have a really like heavy, well, anyway, I won't go into that too much, but, you know, most of these issues are the same issues. You know, there's young people who don't really know what's happening and we don't know how to help them. And I think, you know, we just need to kind of like take a breath and, you know, develop some kind of like broad-based youth services.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's almost that kind of, you only get a service if you're at risk, isn't it? And actually all these access to these things support all the things you're dealing with in terms of risk, aren't they? If young people have got places to go to meet, yeah.
I'm very conscious of the time, and we could probably stay chatting for ages. I think also storming the barricades, creating cultural democracy is probably quite a good place to end. I think we'd all like to do that. But I'd just like to say thank you all very much for participating. Pam, Carrie, Rod, James, and Dawn for hosting today, for calling us all up to take part, and all of you who have posed questions or sat and listened. It's been a really, really great session. Thank you. And I'm hoping that we can not get co-opted into an agenda where we try and solve it, but we actually all carry on working to really listen to young people and to go to where they are, to work with them on this. So thank you very much, and hopefully speak to a lot of you again soon.
Thanks, Julie. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Nice to see you all. Bye-bye.
Yeah.